Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to my presentation on the impact of open source for the European Union, which is the outcome of a study on behalf of DG Connect we have conducted together with the team at Open Forum Europe and my colleagues at Fraunhofer ISI. I'm the project manager of this project, and we have conducted the following steps in order to come to our results. That means we started with a very broad review of the literature and also collected data. Then we had this economic impact assessment, which is the focus of my presentation today. Also, I will talk a little bit about the stakeholder survey. And there were also case studies which were complementing these quantitative analysis, and also by the colleagues of OFE, the analysis of policy initiatives. And that all was then used to derive some recommendations, in particularly addressing the European Union. Now, looking at the overall approach we have been conducting, it's kind of a multi-method approach and also based on different pillars. It means we looked on the one hand at the costs. That means what is the investment both from the EU countries, but also from countries located in the EU towards open source, to get an idea what we spend on the country, but also then on the aggregate EU level, but also at the companies level. On the other hand, and that's a little bit more tricky, we also looked at the benefits. It means here at the macro level, we developed a macroeconomic growth model where we integrated open source and run panel regressions covering almost 20 years to assess the contribution of open source to GDP in the EU. This has been complemented by the results of the stakeholder survey, but also from case studies which have been conducted in the context of the study. It means we have here then the opportunity to then compare the cost with the benefit results and get then some cost benefit ratios. And we are then able to validate not only the assessment of the cost between the macro and the micro level, and the benefits between the macro and the micro level, but also the cost benefit ratio. That's the logic of the whole approach in order to come to really validated and sound results. Now on the data, the data is still a challenge, and we relied on data kind of at GitHub on the repository. Because here at the TU Delft, they downloaded all the information up to 2018. And that means we have 1.3 billion commits, 32 million users, which have also 1.5 million organizational affiliations and country codes. We had around 700,000 organizations at this time. And this has been then combined with other economic data to come up with then some assessment of both the cost and the benefits. Here, this is the rough developments in the last 10 years up to 2018. There are new figures available which show that after some consolidations in 2018, 2019, especially also due to the takeover of GitHub by Microsoft, but now we see it's back on track. And we see here Germany, the UK, and France as the top 3 countries based on the number of commits. We did also, and this is another validation of our approach, we also looked at the contributors which have links to their country origins. And here again, we see here Germany and the UK and France as the top country. And we see a little bit of a stagnation in 2018, but I said in 2020, it's up again. We have to see what will be the situation after COVID-19. That's interesting then to see in the future. Now about the cost-based impact assessment, this is more or less the baseline. And we had, as I already mentioned, we have 2 pillars. We looked at the effort by member states and also at the efforts by the most active companies which have their headquarters in the EU member states, taking not into account affiliates of Microsoft and other US players. And the basic assumption beyond this approach is that the benefits should at least outweigh the cost invested into open source. And that means this is really then the lower or the lowest bound of the economic benefit of open source. Now, what do we see as a reference? We have then this is not a perfect reference, but it's just an important number, is that in 2018 we had around 3 million employees in the computer programming sector in the EU. And what we find is that we have around 260,000 contributors to GitHub. It means a little bit less than 10% of all employees. And you have to know that not all contributors have links to countries, therefore we probably miss another 10%. That's an issue. Now, if you look at the average personal cost, here we also use the average cost in this sector, and then we come to 14 billion personal cost in 2018. If we look at the commits of 30 million in 2018 by EU member countries or contributors which have a link to a EU member state, which includes also the UK, we get to an effort of around 16,000 full-time equivalent. And here it would be an investment of 1 billion personal cost. And this relationship also confirms other studies which show that open source developers spend around 10% or maybe a little bit less on average on open source during their week. And this is therefore another kind of indication that this makes sense. Now looking at the companies level, we have the most active companies identified, and they contribute more than 12% of all commits of the EU, and they employ more than 1 million employees. And we find especially a very high share of small companies. That's very, very important to mention. And what also very important is that the smaller the companies, the higher are their investment, compared to the company size. That means, for example, those which have between 11 and 100 employees invest more than 5% of their full-time equivalents to open source. That means we have here also, if we compare that with the macro-based cost assessment, a nice validation of our results. Now coming to the benefits, which is, as I already mentioned, a little bit more tricky here. I'm not showing this kind of equation which is the base for our results, but we find a significant impact of the pool of open source contributed by the EU member states to the EU GDP. And what we find concrete is that the 10% increase which we have seen, for example, between 2017 and 18, contributed to the GitHub, generated 0.4% of the GDP in EU. And if we take then the overall numbers, we get to around 60 billion per year. If we look at the commits, the so-called elasticity is even 0.6%, and we get then even 95 billion per year in 2018. That means overall, these are really highly significant results, and they are also quite significant in numbers. And in the long run, we could say that if the contribution to open source continues with a kind of 10% increase per year, we could assume additional GDP of 100 billion per year. If we include the UK, if we exclude that, that's probably around 2/3 of this number. Now, if we compare these costs and the benefits, we get a ratio of 1 to 4. Here we also consider hardware cost because software developers also need hardware. And here we took kind of the average investment per employee, which might be also a little bit too high. On the other hand, we have also to take into account that the benefits of open source in 2018 for the GDP also relies on open source developed in previous years. And here we consider the last 5 years due to some other information we know about the survival rate of code over time. That was then our assumption, and therefore we get to this figure 1.1 to 4. To complement our results, we also looked at the views of the stakeholders. That means here the idea was to get a complementary insight, and overall this was really widely distributed. We got almost 1,000 responses, complete answers a little bit more than 100 due to some tricky questions which were not so easy to answer. What are the main results? The incentives to contribute are really finding technical solution, carrying forward the state of the art of technology, but also very important is to avoid vendor lock-in, and also knowledge seeking, knowledge creation is very important. From the benefit side, the highest benefits are related to the topic of really that open source is supporting open standards and interoperability. And since I'm doing kind of a lot of standardization research, I'd like this nice comparable insight, and also improved access to code, and also the independence from proprietary software providers. The costs in general are less relevant. Here, error susceptibility is an issue, and also the cost for skilled labor contributing to open source is an issue. And the most and the named cost benefit ratio is 1 to 10, which is not so far away from the other cost benefit ratio we calculated based on the macro level results. It means overall it's a very significant investment by the EU countries and EU located companies into open source. That means minimum investment is 1 billion per year in 2018, but probably it's more than double or even triple, because we were quite conservative in our approach. On the other hand, we see a significant contribution of open source to GDP in the EU. It means a 10% increase per year would generate additional 100 billion euros in the EU, including the UK per year. What we also looked at is, following Frank Nagel's work in the US, that open source is also contributing to the foundation of startups. Here, additional 1,000 ITC startups per year, including the UK, have been calculated, means another important growth driver in the long run. From the case studies, we know especially that from the public sector, the savings in total cost of ownership is very important, but also the avoidance of vendor lock-in. Further benefits of open source are related to openness, especially here standardization and interoperability is named. Independence and also labor cost savings are important aspects. Based on this finding, we derived some policy recommendations, which I show here in an overview. I cannot go into that because this would need another at least 50 minutes to look at that. But you see here a very broad set and portfolio of measures, starting with building institutional capacity also in the public sector, because that's a requirement for getting all the other instruments really running and being effective. Knowledge creation and diffusion, it means also invest in R&D, and human capital will be key. That will be a big challenge, but also kind of provide an adequate regulatory environment. And finally, also open source hardware, which has been an aspect of the study, has to be considered. And finally, we have to think not in the long, but probably in the short run also about sustainability issues related to open source, how sustainable solutions can be pushed by using open source. That means, in summary, we have a large economic impact. Also, maybe in the future for open source hardware, public policy is needed to scale up this, to incentivize open source production in the long run, because this is benefiting the European economy, and therefore we need a comprehensive and coordinated policy approach, which is based on really institutional capacities at this various layers of the public sector. It means not only at the EU level, but also the national and even the regional or municipal level. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions, you can send me emails anytime.